Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How are you?
I'm doing well. We got to talk to Glenna Goldis today, who's a lawyer, and she has an amazing, very informed perspective on a lot of the cases that are happening right now in the U.S. She's been writing about this, and we cover some of the more recent things happening in the Supreme Court, some of the state cases, and she kind of helps us break this down because, as we talked about before we hit record, it's really complicated to know, and all of this legal speak is difficult to decipher. So Glenna came on the show today to help us make sense.
Yeah, the legal speak is very difficult to understand, and yet it feels like it's pivotal. It's really, really important that we do understand what's going on because people can go into despair so quickly in this world. And what's amazing about Glenna is that she breaks down, let's say, the Alabama case. She breaks down the Scrutiny case that went to the Supreme Court in a very understandable way, so that people can say, okay, I've got a grasp on that and I can keep going. But another thing Glenna does that I particularly am a big fan of, her Substack is phenomenal resource for the history of how did we get here, step by step. How did this phenomenon happen? And she's really, it's my favorite for kind of figuring out what actually went down in the decades preceding this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll hear when we talk to Glenna, she is probably, of all the attorneys I've met in this world, she knows the history of gender medicine better than most. And so she's really well positioned to help us explain what things mean. She describes kind of the word games that the ACLU lawyers use, for example, and the way they are trying to obfuscate reality. I mean, she's really insightful. And I'd like to say that we recorded this before Scrutiny was in the Supreme Court, before oral arguments. So she kind of analyzes it from before we heard these arguments. But if you want to follow up, she's done some really good kind of threads on X when she was at the Supreme Court listening to the arguments. So please follow her. It's Unyielding Bicyclist. We'll be sure to include her Twitter and Substack in the notes. So do go check out what she has to say since Scrutiny was heard. And she also talks about these letters written by attorneys general, which accuse the American Academy of Pediatrics of consumer fraud. And what's really interesting is that Glenna's work as an attorney is in consumer fraud specifically. So again, she's really well positioned to help us understand what that means. And lastly, you'll hear we looked at a video that Trump put out about a year ago where he described some of the plans he has around things like pediatric gender medicine and Title IX stuff. So she helps us break down the statements he made and how it might look in practice if he were to execute those claims or those promises. And of course, with the inauguration coming up, there's lots to see whether or not those things will play out the way he claimed.
It's exciting times we're in, and I think it's hard to keep up. And somebody like Glenna can actually help us kind of catch up. Well, somebody like me can help me catch up.
Yeah, so I'll just read you a little bit more about Glenna. She's a lefty lesbian lawyer dedicated to uncovering the truth about gender-affirming care. She believes that healthcare providers have misled the public, causing significant harm to their patients, many of whom are gay or neurodivergent, and creating broader societal repercussions. Formerly known online as Unyielding Bicyclist, Glenna now channels her unwavering commitment to justice into investigating what she calls the gender-affirming care scam, advocating for accountability and protecting vulnerable communities. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Glenna Goldis.
We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show. Hi, Stella, and welcome to the show, Glenna.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. We're both big fans of your Substack, and I've been consuming it like a maniac the last few days. It's just amazing. It's really, really good work.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you've covered so many fascinating things. Of course, you are an attorney and you write about a lot of the legal cases going on, but you've also covered things like the way the media covers steroid use in athletes versus testosterone use in females. You've talked about gender identity treatments, quote unquote, back in the 90s. Like, you've done a broad and very deep dive into lots of different subjects. So we're thrilled to have you. And of course, we want to focus with you on some of the cases that are taking place right now in the US. And so something very interesting that we'd love to ask you about is a letter signed by 21 attorneys general from different Republican states, basically describing what the AAP has done in terms of putting forward the idea that puberty blockers are safe as a potential consumer fraud, right? And you have a background in consumer fraud. Help us understand what this letter means and tell us more about this.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really exciting letter that was sent by these 21 states to the American Academy of Pediatrics back in September. And the letter does a couple of things. First, it lays out kind of generally the problems with pediatric gender medicine with a focus on puberty blockers and the lack of evidence supporting them, and particularly the lack of evidence supporting the idea that it's, quote, irreversible. And then the next thing the letter does is it demands documents and information from AAP. So it kind of opens up this investigation by those states. And at that point, that was an informal letter. And so it had the effect of, you get a letter from a state attorney general, you want to respond to it and cooperate. So it was a serious letter, but it wasn't kind of legally binding on them. But then in October, what happened is one of those states who was part of that group sent a civil investigative demand. So that was Montana. And so that is legally binding. And if the AAP does not cooperate with that, then they could be sued by Montana in state court to force them to cooperate.
Okay, so this decision to go after the claim of reversibility, are they claiming this a fraudulent statement, or help us understand why come at this from a fraud perspective? I think it's very interesting, but as a non-attorney, I'm just so curious about what does that mean? Are there other precedents for this approach, and why use the fraud angle?
Sure. Well, it's pretty basic. As we all know, if we spend a lot of time in this space, there are a lot of statements flying around that are not true, or maybe they're technically true, but we think they are tricky. We think they're causing kind of a false impression in people's minds. And consumer protection law is fantastic for that. We have a lot of different laws that apply to false statements, everything from, perjury to other types of fraud. But consumer fraud is the most flexible kind of standard. So you could say something that is technically true, but if it's creating a false impression, then that might violate the law. And it's a very strong tool for that. And it's a very good one for this context based on what we're seeing. And so for the AAP, what they did was they issued this statement in 2018, which was, kind of purported to be medical guidelines. And they published it in their, medical journal, which used to be a really prestigious journal. So it looked like medical. But it contained all this kind of dogma and stuff we're used to seeing. It wasn't real medicine. There's just this long section of defining terms, which is just dictating, that sex isn't real and stuff like that. It's a very, very weird document. And it wasn't based on science, although it kind of purported to be. So they had a lot of statements that were followed by footnotes, and the footnotes looked very serious, and they cited to medical journals. But then it was discovered, and particularly by the sexologist James Cantor, that these citations did not say what they were supposed to say. They were just kind of plugged in there to create the appearance of a sciencey document. So right away, James Cantor and then others in our space were very concerned about that. Julia Mason is a pediatrician in Oregon who was really lobbying the AP to take another look at that statement you issued. It's not good. It's misleading. And one claim in there that is specifically we think false is the idea that puberty blockers are irreversible. And then, that statement is followed by some
reversible. Sorry, that puberty blockers are reversible.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
So, and then not only that, but it's kind of bolstered in a way I think the statement presents it in a way that it seems like there's evidence supporting the claim that it's that they are reversible. But in fact, no, that was just a wish and a prayer kind of thing. So, and everybody in the space has known for years that is a very problematic document and it's inappropriate. And, there are doctors saying that, there are lawyers saying that. Last year, a detransitioner sued the AAP in part based on that statement, accusing them of fraud in Rhode Island. So that idea has been out there. But now, and it's really worth noting that even though there's been so much controversy about this, and the AAP has been openly attacked and criticized from all angles, and its members have begged it to change the statement. Despite all that, the AAP has stood strong. They reaffirmed it last year. They made some noises about revisiting it, but we haven't seen any evidence that they're revisiting it. So they've really been kind of defiant in the face of all this very good faith criticism of them. And so finally, the authorities are taking a look.
Yeah. And if I'm remembering correctly, last year in 2023, when they did reaffirm, quote unquote, this Rafferty statement, Jason Rafferty is the one who drafted this statement. It was after they had kind of informally agreed to do a review of the evidence. So they were implying that there was some data to look at and that they wanted to understand the science better. But before doing any review or, of course, having any results, they said they reaffirmed the statement. So that whole thing has been very strange and didn't feel like it was grounded on science or evidence or research or anything along those lines. So now there's this legal action. So what is it that is being requested in this letter from the AAP? You said there were some document requests or information requests or something. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so they're pretty broad going into, so what was your basis for saying that the puberty blockers were reversible? What studies were you looking at? It's asking for communications between various people who worked on the statement or who are involved in the AAP. It's asking for some of the things I asked for, I didn't really understand, which is interesting. So, what did you do to make sure that electronic medical records incorporated this? It was something with electronic medical records, which is interesting because one of the weird things about the AAP statement is it kind of recommends that electronic medical records reflect gender identity or something like that. And it's are you saying that we're supposed to falsify sex, which is something that you guys have talked about in your interviews?
Wow.
So it's kind of tracing back. And so putting the pieces together, it sounds like it is suspected that AAP was involved in really messing with the medical system in a dangerous way, possibly. It seems like somebody is suspecting that.
That's great. We've got a policy in GenSpect, a kind of a model policy about electronic medical records, saying, literally, clarifying the need for biological sex to be recorded and in the electronic medical records because it's caused havoc, absolute havoc. So
yeah,
and there was one part. Oh, sorry, you go ahead. Then I'll ask you. Go on.
Oh, I think there's something in there about scripts and training and things that also implying that maybe these AAP guidelines were being pushed out to doctors, and if they were being pushed out by AAP, then that could be meaningful in terms of how responsible they are and things like that.
There was one part of it that you just said as a throwaway remark before we started about the public nuisance aspect. What is that?
Well, public nuisance law is a different area of law from consumer fraud, and we see it sometimes being used in these cases where there has been a giant societal screw up. So, for example, we were talking about opioids. Attorneys General alleged that would cause a public nuisance because the way it just caused so many people to become addicted and die, and that's kind of a big, broad claim that is brought. And another one is vaping. So there have been lawsuits accusing Juul of creating a public nuisance because they advertised vaping to kids, and then all these kids became addicted.
So it's creating that would be a problem.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And is the nuisance bit about when false advertisement or misleading representation creates a problem? Is it still related to that fraud aspect?
These are good questions. I would say I'm not like a public nuisance expert. It is a separate
You
claim
look like
than
a
fraud.
public nuisance and an expert, Glenna.
I am.
Right. Oh, thank you. Yeah, some people might think that soon, hopefully, but if all goes well. But yeah, so public nuisance is, and to be clear, like I don't think anybody has brought this up in the context of gender until your producer did just 10 minutes ago. But now I think it's great, and maybe it'll turn into a blog post. But no, I mean, that's like the dream is that if the public becomes so aware of this problem and their thinking on it shifts so much that, because at first everyone saw it as medical malpractice. And like, sure, yes, I hope those lawsuits are successful. It's not wrong, but it also doesn't seem like the core of the problem. When people started turning to consumer frauds, I felt like, yes, like that feels right. This is a fraud. And then when your producer said public nuisance, it was like, oh, it is a public nuisance. That's even better than fraud. It's totally a public nuisance because of the way, and this is not like a legal analysis because like I said, this is not my area of law, but just the sense that that these companies created this problem that did not exist before and definitely did not need to exist and caused so much havoc on a societal level, not just a bunch of individuals, but really like our whole society has been hijacked. So again, this is not a legal opinion, but interesting idea.
Okay, so are there, I mean, you raised opioids a minute ago. Are there other kind of cases that maybe would be familiar in the public consciousness that could help us make some predictions or try to understand, like, how does this letter to the AAP, like, how might it play out? What might happen here?
Sure. So how it might play out, in terms of precedents, it's always so hard with gender. On the other hand, when you're talking about letters and CIDs going out from AG's offices, that becomes kind of more predictable. So like I said, the letter itself was not so much binding, but with the CID, that could lead to court action where, maybe Montana says the AAP is not cooperating, and so they file a motion in court, and that would be called a motion to compel. The AAP itself could bring a motion first, and that would be called a motion to quash, and they would say, you don't have a right to ask us for this information. So then it would end up in court that way. Otherwise, it's likely to go underground for a while, which is unfortunate for the public in terms of those of us who find this interesting. It's kind of normal for these investigations to play out behind closed doors. The state doesn't have any interest in telegraphing everything it's doing. And so they'll just be like collecting documents from AAP and analyzing them. This could go on like a year, maybe, possibly even more. And then they'd be faced with a choice. Do we want to try to make a settlement agreement with the AAP? Or if they don't want to, or if the sides are not able to come to an agreement, then they would go to court and they would bring civil charges.
Could I ask you, people have always said, oh, wait for the detrans lawsuits to start, wait for the lawsuits to start. We've been hearing this forever and ever and ever. Well, I feel like that. And now they have started. And where are we, do you think, in this lawsuit kind of, you know what I mean? Where are we? Are we at the very beginning? Are we at the beginning of the end, if you follow me, in that point? Because this was the big point for everybody. And I find it impossible to figure out the lawyerly stuff. It just seems to send me asleep. Sorry.
Okay.
But she's still awake right now, so that's a good sign.
I'm hanging on, but I'm really looking forward to getting back into the history. So I'm just, I'm going through the motions now.
This is a lot of pressure for me to keep Stella awake long enough so we can get to history. So in terms of where we are, I think it's not just a question of detransitioner lawsuits. There are going to be so many types of lawsuits going forward, especially with the new administration coming in, with Republicans coming into control. We could have federal government investigations from executive agencies and from Congress. The detransitioners lawsuits are great. They are just one of the arms here. So there's so many categories of lawsuits. And I feel like you almost asked me a literary question more than a law question, because it's like, where in the storyline are we? Like, have we finished the introductory remarks? Think we move into like, is this like act 2 or it gets kind of too complicated? And I would say I personally kind of understand
if this was a 5-act play.
Well, there are no second acts in America, so just, wipe that out. And then, But I think what you're really getting at is will become more interesting soon. And because the detransitioner lawsuits from our perspective have not been interesting because they're playing out behind closed doors or they're just at like a very early stage. Oh. And when they do get discovery, we don't see it. Like the lawyers are seeing it. They might be having a very good time, but we just see like these little drops of information like trickling out. And so it's boring for us. And I can see why everyone at home is like, oh, I'm sick of these lawsuits that aren't getting anywhere. But I would say sit tight because other types of lawsuits are going to come online soon. And like I said, investigations. And so you'll be getting more information from different sources.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a good example is what we discovered from the Alabama documents regarding the WPATH and then the pressure from the HHS. Like all of that came out not in a detrans lawsuit. Like tell us a little bit about that case and what's going on.
Yeah, Alabama. And so all over the country now, there are lawsuits being filed by the ACLU and by other so-called like social justice organizations or other like GLAAD and Lambda Legal. And by the way, there are two GLAADs. So I'll be talking about GLAAD with 1A and not 2A, but I'm really annoyed they do that to us. But anyway, so there are lawsuits all over the country because of that. They were provoked by the certain states in America. We're up to 26 now, have some sort of limitation on pediatric gender medicine. So they passed these limitations or bans beginning in 21. There was a trickle at first, and then in 2023, a bunch of states started doing it. So now we're at half the country. And then in many of those cases, not every single one of them, these nonprofits partnering with big law firms, they file lawsuits to challenge the bans and say that those bans, which were passed at the state level, violate the federal constitution. And their main claim there is that it's discriminatory against so-called transgender kids because depriving them of the healthcare that they supposedly need, or else they will die.
And we could say it's discriminatory of pre-homosexual children. Yes, I absolutely think that this healthcare is hurting gay kids. And I wish that were coming out more in the lawsuits. Unfortunately, right now it's something that just those of us on the outside have been trying to yell and like hope the judges hear us. Like also another argument is we got it into our
on the windows.
Brief.
I know.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful for that. So
we win for the homosexual line.
Yes. So these lawsuits that are happening, they should be all about homosexuality. They are not at all about homosexuality in reality, in terms of what's in the papers, unfortunately. So a bunch of us are trying to, I'm not going to go on that tangent, but Alabama was the second state to get sued because it was the second state to pass one of these bans. So that was in 22 is when they passed that. And then they were immediately sued by several different organizations, not the ACLU. I have to remind myself that one was some others, HRC, and then of course a big law firm, of course, and GLAAD with 1A. They sued in Alabama. So that was what's interesting with that case. So it's the second one, but it's the first one that I'm really excited about because they decided to pursue discovery against WPATH, which was an aggressive move compared to like the first lawsuit that went forward in Arkansas. So they said, hey, these organizations like GLAAD, you are the plaintiff's lawyers, they're making the case that this healthcare is necessary. And the way they argue it's necessary is by pointing to WPATH and saying like WPATH knows everything and they are God. And they say that the healthcare is necessary, like case closed. And so Alabama very intelligently said, well, like prove it. Like what's going on with WPATH? Why should we trust WPATH? And not enough people in the history of the world have asked that about WPATH or its predecessor, but Alabama did. And so they demanded those documents. They had to fight for those. Because this was kind of as a third-party subpoena against WPATH, I believe, and which you can do in these lawsuits. And so, WPATH and the plaintiffs are fighting them in court, but they eventually were given the right to demand those documents. And this was another one of those situations that played out mostly behind closed doors and probably seemed very frustrating from the outside. I mean, I remember seeing it and wishing I knew what was going on. Then all of a sudden, a couple of months ago, I think it was like June, July of 24, all these papers burst into view from the Alabama lawsuit, which are some of the documents that they received from WPATH, internal emails from WPATH in the run-up to publishing SOC 8. And so these documents show up they're filed as part of these, just formal things happening in court. So they pop out that way and then they're suddenly public record. They're still heavily redacted. And I think there are some documents we haven't seen at all, But what we have seen is very interesting. And you see all these, damning. It's because they show the run up to publishing. They show what the methodology was, and they were not running science experiments.
By the way, guys, just methodology was in big air quotes. Keep going.
Thank you, Sasha. I don't want anyone to be confused about how I feel about the quote unquote methodology here.
Yeah.
So they in fact show that they tried to do, or they thought about doing scientific studies. They commissioned them from Johns Hopkins and Baltimore, but then they blocked them from. They did not like the results, and so they stopped them from being published, essentially. And I think they dispute exactly what happened there. But they kept that information away from the public. They did not want to see it. They didn't want anyone else to see it, and so that was revealed. We also saw that they were subject to pressure from outside forces, and they were very receptive to that pressure, which was political. For example, from Rachel Levine, who was, most importantly, an admiral in some military service no one has ever heard of. But this is a government official with the Biden administration. He was pressuring WPATH to drop the age limits that WPATH was about to publish. And the AAP, which we were talking about earlier, AAP was also pressuring them to drop the age limits. And then the discussion of that, again, had nothing to do with the science, nothing to do with whether it's actually good or bad for a 16-year-old to get a mastectomy. It was all just about PR and winning lawsuits. That's what they cared about. And that was all revealed in those emails.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm always curious about whether or not information like this, like, does it trickle down into the public consciousness? Are people aware of these things? Like, I mean, I think people like us three were already in the weeds. So when this happened, I mean, I gobbled up all of the documents I could from Alabama, and it was really shocking and damning stuff. But I mean, none of us are normies, so to speak. But do you think that these kind of revelations make a difference in the big picture, or what is going to happen? There must be legal reasons that this is going to be very damning, but do you think that this is going to, it's almost like a question about, like, at what point do legal changes have an impact on public consciousness, if they do?
Yeah. And well, first of all, we hope they'll have legal consequences, and I think they will eventually, but you'd be surprised at how slowly the law works. Like, I was just reading I think I was reading the second. I'm going to put Stella to sleep again because I'm talking the Seventh Circuit, which is our most recent.
It's okay.
Yeah. So Seventh Circuit, Chicago, it doesn't matter. We're constantly getting a trickle of news about these pediatric gender medicine lawsuits because there are so many of them, and because there are so many appeals of little intermediate decisions. And so, like, the most recent one of those came out of Chicago. Like, it's good. It doesn't have everything I'd like to see, but it has the right outcome. And it has a line in there where it just says, like, and WPATH actually has faced criticism. And I read that, I'm like, oh, what are you going to cite? Because just think for yourself, not as a lawyer. Like, if you were writing the sentence, WPATH has faced criticism, like, they might not be perfect, then you have to back that up with citations. Like, what citations would you use? I think, like, a whole bunch of ideas come into your head of, like, what you'd want people to know and what seems like reliable information. And probably a lot of what you're thinking is from the last 6 months, definitely the past year, right? Like, just like, wow, there's so much to tell everyone about WPATH. But the citations in this decision were from 2 court cases from the 2010s. One was from 2013, one from 2019. Like, this is, like, the best information we have, really, about why WPATH is problematic. Wow. So it's kind of hilarious. And as a lawyer, I get it. Like, this is how law works. Like, court decisions are just better than any other kind of information. But as a person with a brain, I know court decisions are, like, the worst place to get your information. They're so like, for funny kind of legal reasons, it's going to take a while for this to, like, really sink in. Like, we need some court to say, even though it's so obvious reading those emails, like, oh, WPATH is cooked. Like, we need a judge to say, well, it looks like WPATH is problematic based on these emails, and then that judge will be cited. But, like, it needs to go through those steps. It needs to be laundered through the judicial process of, like, how things become credible, real knowledge.
It's so interesting. And I think I met a crowd of lawyers in Ireland. I was at a party recently, and I started, I was kind of, messing, slagging them a bit. And I started saying, like, how did you let in self-ID in 2015? They looked at me gormlessly, like, these were really high-level lawyers in Ireland. These were as good as you get of of the lawyerly minds. They were clueless. They didn't even know we had self-ID, and they didn't know what I was talking about. And I was like, wow, you're a laughing stock of the world with your self-ID. And then I was saying, and the hate speech bill and all this, and they were just clueless. If you're not clued in to our thing, it was clearly it had passed them by. Like, you know what I mean? Oh, right, yeah, the hate speech bill. But they had no idea. I know I'm just talking about Ireland, but like it's similar around the world, these crazy bills. And they had no idea how problematic it was, how badly worded, how circular the definitions were. No idea. They had no idea.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And even once I start to explain the circular definitions, like you would hope, okay, circular definitions, like every lawyer knows that's bad. We all know that we're supposed to define words. That's pretty basic. But it actually is hard to explain the gender identity problem and to explain, like, look, the ACLU is going into court and talking about sex and gender in ways that are obviously unconventional and obviously in violation of the normal definitions, but they're not offering their own definitions. Like, that is like the three of us, we know that's bonkers, but everybody else, including lawyers, they kind of fill in the blanks themselves. And they're like, well, that can't be happening. Or they're like, well, but we know what a trans kid is. We don't need it defined. It's like, no, you're a lawyer. Come on, get with the program. We got to define this. Like,
yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And you wrote an incredible piece recently about some of the tactics being used by the ACLU and specifically Chase Strangio, and kind of how language is being used and manipulated to create these illusions. You kind of referenced, or you made a parallel between like a magician and how a magician kind of takes advantage of people's assumptions and their desire to believe, and like the way you set up things to create illusion, which is remarkable. We highly recommend people to check out your Substack, but maybe this can kind of move us into the Scrutiny case, because this seems like it's really important. Help us understand this case for people like us who are non-attorneys, non-legal. What is the Scrutiny case and why does it matter?
Sure. So we were just talking about those pediatric gender medicine cases that are across America. So Scrutiny is Tennessee's edition of that. So they're all pretty similar. And in Tennessee's, we have, and this is the ACLU that brought this one along with other firms, including like a major commercial law firm, as they usually do. So they are representing this this group of very sympathetic plaintiffs who are three kids, the kids' moms, and a gynecologist who provides this treatment. The gynecologist is less sympathetic, but we'll get to her. So that case, this was in Tennessee. It was filed in 23, so it's not one of the earliest ones, and yet it's somehow the first one to get to the Supreme Court, which is interesting. And it was appealed at a very early stage. So this is not a situation where it's already been to trial, it's already been to discovery, it's had interesting emails come out, like in Alabama. This is kind of a stunted case where there's just like a bunch of paperwork filed by the attorneys so far, and that's what is being looked at by appeals courts. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. It is, so it's being heard by the Supreme Court. Right now we're recording on November 21st. So it'll be on December 4th. It will be heard by the Supreme Court just in like a 1 hour oral argument down there. And it's a huge deal because it's the first one to get to the Supreme Court, and we're going to see what they think about this subject. And there's just one main legal claim, which is that it discriminates against these transgender kids under the Equal Protection Clause of our 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And then there are two arguments as to why it is supposedly discriminatory. And so one is that transgender people are kind of, it's called a suspect class, the same way that women are a suspect class, or in a certain way, or that Black people are. Yeah. So that is one argument, because if transgender people constitute a quote unquote suspect class, then that means that any law that like has to do with them, courts have to examine it more closely than they would any other law. And like the state needs a better reason to put it in place. So it just makes it harder for the state to defend their law.
Can I ask, this suspect class, are homosexuals a suspect class?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Not for Stella, but you're going to kill me. This is a very legal answer, but yeah. So gay people under the federal constitution, no, actually, and I think I know why, but there was obviously a big push for this, especially during the years of gay marriage. Like, hey, gay people should be a suspect class. Like, this is the march of progress. But this, the federal courts never made them one. I think some of the states maybe did, but because there was so much sympathy for gay people in the courts, they kind of officially did not grant that status. But the level of review they give to the laws is, so normally if somebody's not in a suspect class, the laws just are reviewed under a standard called rational basis. And with gay people, like the courts felt bad about that. And so they call it, or it is called rational basis with a bite that gay people receive. And like everybody who works in the area of law just knows that even though it's called rational basis that's applied, the courts are going to be like a little more sympathetic than normal. So that is like a weird piece of history. I think the reason this played out that way is because it's really hard when you think about it to define what a gay person is for legal purposes.
I know. That's exactly why I asked, because
Really?
it's somewhat subjective. I mean, like if you're not in a same-sex relationship, married, for example, but you like women, I mean, how is that something we can make legal determinations based off of? It is subjective. It's in your brain. I mean, it's based on intimacy, but like if you don't have a legal marriage, then like what makes a homosexual legally different from anyone else? That's why I asked, because it's in my brain.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay. All right. So keep going with this whole scrutiny thing and the suspect class. I'm fascinated by this and I don't really get it, but there's something weird here.
Yeah. So transgender people should not be classified as a suspect class because it's impossible to define what they are. It's even harder than in the gay context. And of course, as we know, it's totally subjective whether somebody is transgender. So that's one of the arguments about how it would be discrimination. And then the other argument is that these laws are actually a form of sexism because they dictate that so the example that the ACLU uses a lot is like gynecomastia. These laws allow boys to receive, mastectomies if they have gynecomastia, but they don't allow girls to have mastectomies if they want to present as male or however you describe it. So the ACLU argues that as a form of sexism. And as we know, as I mentioned, women are a suspect class, or another way to put it is sex is, a classification. So they're trying to lodge transgender issues into sexism.
Oh, okay. What do you think is going to happen with this case? This is strange.
Yeah. Well, my prediction, and so this decision, it could come out any time, most likely in June is what everyone assumes. So until then we'll be speculating, but it could be earlier, like in the spring. My prediction would be that the headline will be that transgender people are not a suspect class, and also that these laws are not a form of sexism. That would be my guess about kind of the bottom line. But what I'm concerned about is how the opinions are written, because, the way these opinions come out is not just like an up or down, yes or no thing. They write these long explanations, the justices, as to why they ruled the way they did. And I'm concerned that when they do that, they will really bungle everything. And kind of what we've seen judges do in the past, including conservative ones who are basically reaching the right outcome, is that they will basically accept the idea of gender identity. Like they don't challenge that. And like sometimes they might use a different term, or they'll use the basic concepts that the ACLU puts out there, but put a different word on them. So for example, Justice Gorsuch in 2020 in the famous Bostock case, he rejected the term sex assigned at birth, but he used the term sex identified at birth, which is fine. But like the ACLU is fine with that. They just don't want to use the word sex because remember, they don't want to define it. So like any gobbledygook word that replaces sex, they're happy with. And Gorsuch also, he rejected the term sex characteristics, but he changed it to sex distinctions. Basically the same thing in terms of the cosmos of the ACLU's theory of gender and sex. So it was kind of evident in that opinion that the court thought they were being clever by avoiding some landmines and controlling the language themselves, but they bought into the basic theory. And they also did not use the term gender identity at all, which is good in that it didn't solidify gender identity. It didn't state that it was real. So that's a relief. On the other hand, you can't write an opinion about transgender rights without saying gender identity. It's the whole crux of the ACLU's case. You can't write a coherent opinion without saying it. So what Gorsuch did, he wrote an opinion that was, in my opinion, like just not very good and set up all these conflicts going forward that are playing out in the courts today.
Okay, so Glenna, we've been talking a lot about politics in a way. Of course, all this legal stuff has a lot to do with politics. And you are trying to reach out and connect with more lawyers that are coming at the gender question from a liberal perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Yes, so I'm really trying to connect with my fellow lawyers who are gender critical, and they want to see the gender critical movement move forward in a way that reflects our liberal values. So things like free speech, free expression, gay rights, women's rights, and access to justice. And by the way, all those values I just cited are very popular among more centrist and even conservative lawyers as well. So I think this could be a really broad-based organization. I want to connect us all because right now, we know there's all this legal work to be done, but people are having trouble connecting because right now it is the conservatives are very well networked and they're great. They're doing a fantastic job, but they are pursuing conservative values. And I just know from my everyday life that the people I know in New York, they have gender critical leanings as well, but they don't know about connecting with an organization that is known for taking so many positions they disagree with. Like they're skeptical of that is literally a different part of the country and all of that. So I think that I want to make sure that we are all able to talk to each other and that we're not leaving anybody on the sidelines and that we are also making sure that liberal values are represented in the gender critical movement, which I think, as many of us suspect, will prevail. We're all hoping that it prevails and we think that it will. And so I want to make sure that when it does, it looks liberal and it accounts for our values. So I'm connecting all of us. I'm going to give you guys a link. So there's going to be a link to a little join up form, a little survey that you can fill out. And I want all kinds of lawyers to join. We have so many different types of projects that need to move forward. Everything from, changing the law to changing the way that judges in some places like require people to state their pronouns or require people to use preferred pronouns when they're referring to witnesses, all those sorts of things. We need lawyers to work on them. And so I want to call out two groups in particular that I want to reach. One is family law attorneys all over the country, because there is a ton of family law work to be done here. Two types of big conflicts are when CPS or foster care is coming after a family because they won't affirm. Another category of cases is where you have two parents who disagree about how a child should be treated if they're having gender distress or whatever. So those parents are having a lot of trouble finding lawyers who A, understand the trans issue, and B, are okay with representing the view that is non-affirming, that is maybe unpopular in their local community. So we need so many more family law attorneys across the country to get to know this issue and to step up. And if they do, there's a lot of potential business. So in any way, we need to start networking, and this is the way to do it. I personally actually practiced family law for 5 years, and I'm just so excited to get on the phone and talk somebody through because, I'm somebody who knows both these issues. I want to make sure there's more representation out there. And I think there are other lawyers as well who'll be willing to talk to you. So we just need to start talking. And the other category of lawyers who I want to reach out to are the people who are just like me. So you work in a nonprofit or in a government agency run by progressive leaders, and your ideas are different from what's being dictated on high or what is the official policy. That's a little awkward, but I know you're all out there. I know it because I talk to you guys in my everyday life. I don't want to call out anyone in particular, but it's not hard for me to go out and find gender critical liberal lawyers who are working in nonprofits or government. And everybody has the same reason for not speaking louder, which is you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to be blocked from ever getting another job in the future. So we need to connect and support each other because they can't fire all of us.
That's great. We'll definitely include the link to your meetup and your survey. That's so important.
Thank you.
This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion.
It's interesting. I was reading a lot of your Substack, going over all the historical kind of documents, and you were basically, from what I could gather, they were flailing looking for a phrase, and ultimately they landed on gender identity, but they actually tried quite a few phrases, the activists, over the decades. Is that right?
In the 70s and 80s, there were a bunch of different terminologies tried. But then in the early 90s is when they locked in, when some lawyers who were transgender got together and decided what was going to happen. And they really landed on gender identity then. But they weren't totally successful at first. So you still see different ideas floating around in the 90s. But they died out, And then it was the early 90s version from Phyllis Fry and Martine Rothblatt that prevailed, that we can recognize in today's lawsuits, their definition of gender identity. Their non-definition of gender identity, I should say.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, as a therapist, and just probably my personality, I always try to communicate in the way that is palatable to people, right? So sometimes I find myself, sometimes I use people's pronouns. Sometimes I will talk about gender identity. And then in other contexts, I will critique, like, gender identity isn't clinically useful. So, like, I have lots of different ways that I approach these things. And what's been super interesting to me, it's November 21st right now. In the last couple of days, Nancy Mace has made a huge splash on the internet by basically saying, I don't care if Congresswoman Sarah McBride, is identifying as a woman. This is a man, and no men can go into the women's restroom. And, like, there's been lots of kind of stuff going on social media. And I think what has become clear to me is that those of us in the weeds around gender sometimes can complicate the language in a way that is not useful. And sometimes the clearest, simplest language is required. And you're kind of lifting this up as you talked about, sometimes even, Republican lawmakers flub the language and kind of accept the premise of gender identity accidentally in their language. So I just wonder, like, as an attorney, how important is this? Like, how important are these, just like, sex assigned at birth versus identified as birth versus just the word sex? Like, this seems to be almost what everything is falling on.
Yeah, because it's a trick. Because if you use the word sex in all these instances, then the whole thing would fall apart. The ACLU is trying to confuse everybody, and they're making their case much more complicated than it needs to be. And in fact, there's even a simpler way for them to make their case if they just acknowledge that sex is a physical thing, but they don't even want to do that. So, what I've written about is that they can't explain why it's masculine to have a beard, because having a beard is like a physical thing that's caused by, testosterone produced by males. So they cannot argue that they can't explain why this girl who is their client wants to be male and wants to have a beard, because they can't explain what a male is or why a beard is male. And so the way they get around it is just by, like, saying things that don't make any sense. And by saying, like, well, she wants to look like somebody whose sex assigned at birth is male. And it's, sorry, I'm being so confusing because I'm, like, trying to, the language is everything. And if the language were correct in the ACLU's complaints, for example, it would just fall apart and be nothing. It would just be, they would just be saying, like, this, they would be saying nothing. Like,
could we not clarify it? I don't think you're going to agree with me, but I want to hear what your response is. If we said, like, sex is the biological sex class that you're born into, and gender is the roles and expectations that have been formed by society pertaining to your sex, that if our side, for want of a better phrase, could agree on that, well, then we would have something kind of tangible to answer. Because it feels I think it feels very flimsy when everybody's kind of taking a different position. It turns into a Tower of Babel very fast.
Yes. So but the reason why we can't agree on terms with the other side is because the other side is acting in bad faith, and they know that if we have common terms, then it'll be really obvious that their argument sucks. So they're always trying to shimmy away from agreeing to any kind of terminology, because it would just be very simple if everyone were using the same terms to mean the same thing.
But would we not be stronger as a kind of a side if we could agree?
Okay.
If you follow me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, I
find so many people say to me, there's no such thing as what?
Yeah, okay, so I see. So we all agree on sex. We fight about gender. I just have been avoiding gender altogether, but sometimes I say gender nonconforming, and I tell myself it's sort of like one word and it means a specific thing. But I'm very nervous about gender, and how does that play into the whole like the gender medicine thing? Like if we kind of have this agreement about...
it doesn't necessarily, that's leaping ahead just because one says that. Like, I just want to kind of go here for a minute because it's so fraught and it's such a big deal. But like people say, there's no such thing as gender. There's so often people say that. And I'm like, okay, so there's no such thing as being feminine and being masculine. You could go further. You could say there's no such thing as being good looking. There's no such thing as being cheerful, as in these are subjective descriptors, but they also have quite common ground, quite common agreement among us. Well, wait, that you could say that if you looked at research, you could say that men, and if you were going to put the traits pertaining to men, that would be masculinity. So masculinity would have more males are by far, they're much more sociosexual than females. They seek to breed with more people than women do. That the research shows that. It also shows that, for example, little boys prefer rough play to little girls, and boys tend to be more physically aggressive, and women tend to be more relationally aggressive. This is established. Of course, there is many exceptions to prove the rule, but it's very well established that you could say there's a good 70% overlap between the males and the females on this, and it's been what's the word? It's been documented again and again and again. So to pretend that this isn't something that happens and there aren't certain typically male traits and typically female traits is arguably how we got into the mess in the first place.
I think so. Like, it's hard for me to answer that because I need to know like what we're using the term gender for. Because if you want to use gender to mean like whether someone is masculine or feminine, then like sure, why not? But then if you try to turn that into a legal concept, God, no. Like, I don't see how this could ever be helpful in a legal context. But maybe you could change my mind.
I want to talk about it in discourse.
You want to move on.
We have a more,
yeah.
No. I just want to talk about it in discourse so I can say the word masculine without getting my head bitten off, because I'm like, masculine covers certain well-established traits, and as does feminine, and it does. To abolish words is so more than reductive. It's so nihilistic, because it's like, oh my God, are we seriously saying that there aren't more traits in the males and certain more traits in the females?
For legal documents, it's still totally useless. I mean, in discourse for cultural commentary, I think it's very useful. But I think when we write law, it has to be the categories have to be so clearly defined and understood.
I fully agree with you about law. I had moved away from law. I was just saying that this kind of being
you just want a lawyer to sign off on your idea.
Well, no, I want to kind of open up the discussion, because I find it so regressive when people say you can't say masculine, you can't say feminine, you can't say gender. And I'm like, I can say all of those. And we have a fairly good understanding, just like you have a fairly good understanding that most good-looking people are symmetrical. Not all of them are, but we have a fairly good understanding of that person's good-looking and that person's cheerful. There are certain traits that we have a common understanding about, that we don't have to shrivel up and die when somebody uses the word. Not in a legal context. You're not going to get cheerfulness into a legal document.
All right.
But in other contexts.
I mean, I see what you're saying about it being somewhat useful, but I think in a lot of contexts it winds up being imprecise also. I mean, even you just said it was like, okay, 70% of males feel this way, or you're saying okay, like girls like to play in a certain way. Well, I didn't. And it's totally interesting. Like, and I'm not arguing that we should never use masculine or feminine, but I'm just saying, I think there are a couple of different problems that arise and they get kind of conflated. So the idea that we should never use gender ever for either political reasons or because it's not precise enough. First is the idea that like there are better terms than gender to bring up, or the idea that like it's accurate, but we should watch our words because of the implications. But, but imprecision, I think, is the main problem, at least for me. Not the fact that it's totally wrong to talk about it, but just that like maybe there's a more precise way. I also understand the appeal of talking about concepts like masculine and feminine in order to explore, for example, like I think it's really interesting that gay people tended to be gender nonconforming as kids.
There you go.
And
that's fascinating.
Yeah, totally fascinating. And it would be very hard if I know why. Like, who? Like when I was playing with Ninja Turtles, I don't think anybody was thinking, "Oh yes, well she's really gonna like, like." What is the connection between Ninja Turtles and then like, liking women when you're older?
Fancying women
makes no sense at all. But yeah, so I would love more research on that.
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that for 1,000 days. Like I'm so interested in that point.
Me too.
And like, if I can't get off. If I can't get off the first sentence because they say there's no such thing as a gender non-conforming child, and I'm like, but there is. There really is.
What about if they just said sex non-conforming? Because we are talking about sex, we're saying like I was more similar to the vast majority of boys than the vast majority of girls.
Yeah,
so
but that's what the word gender. That's what the word gender has been used for. Because arguably the word sex, we'll move on from it now in a second, but the word sex used to mean, let's say, the biological sex, but then from the 60s, 70s, 80s onwards, it was used for intercourse in public discourse way more. And suddenly we had two words saying very different things. We had biological sex and intercourse sex, and it was like, and I could see how they started. And yes, some people say it was prissy, but I would say it was also definitional. That they wanted to, they were not talking about intercourse because sex was being driven down our heads in the tabloids. Every 10 seconds you'd see sex on the front pages of the tabloids in the 80s. Sex. So and it was not being used for biological sex. Anyway, I'll move on.
Okay, we know this is a passionate topic for Stella, but I want to definitely ask you, Glenna, about a video came out about a year ago where Donald Trump made several statements, and I'm going to outline them because I don't expect you to memorize that, but he made several statements regarding things around, quote, gender-affirming care, right? And I want to ask you about what these possibly mean, how he might do what he claims he's going to do here. So like there are kind of like 5 or 6 main points. One of them is he says he wants to revoke Biden's policies on gender-affirming care. I presume this is about when Biden first came into office, how he made, there was some sort of like a document or a statement about gender-affirming care and trans youth. What is Trump claiming he wants to revoke, and how? How would he do that?
Sure. So at the beginning of his term, yes, Biden issued this executive order laying out his priorities, and he kind of gave his marching orders to the various agencies as to how he wanted them to act. And then in so many instances, they really did. They really did move forward, and they issue new rules that were in favor of gender identity, and they took positions in lawsuits that way. And so that executive order wormed its way into the law through those channels. And now Trump is coming into office, and he's likely to issue an executive order that says to reverse it. But that just because he makes an executive order does not mean that everything will automatically change. So some of those things that Biden did, his administration, they're law now. And so there's like a long process to go through to reverse them. So these are the rules that came out of most famously Department of Education, but also Health and Human Services and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So workplace, healthcare, schools, all those rules are in the law now. So that being said, even though there might be a complicated road ahead in terms of the law, like we know Trump is not going to enforce those rules.
So you're basically saying there's a long process if Trump wanted to. I mean, he's not going to enforce whatever laws were put into place by Biden, but you're saying there's a long process if he wants to change them, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a question mark. Like it's possible that maybe so all these laws about gender identity have been challenged in court, some of them like by multiple different plaintiffs all over the country. So there's all these lawsuits going on. It may be possible for maybe they'll just move quickly and the courts will throw out the rules that way. Or maybe the Trump administration will just settle with the people who sued them. And if the courts accept the settlement, then the rules could kind of go away that way in terms of being enjoined. So I don't want to bore you with the law. The fact is, like, he's not going to enforce the crazy ideas about there being like, special bathrooms for non-binary people or whatever. Like, you don't have to worry about that, realistically speaking, coming from the Trump administration. And then there's a question of whether he will go further than rolling back regulations and actually improve the law and to, clarify what sex means, for example, and also to like an area that I think is really important is changing the rules around prisons. So the big law there is PREA and some regulations issued under PREA. So those are housed under the Department of Justice. So what the Trump administration should do is like right away get started on trying to issue new regulations under PREA in the Department of Justice.
We just want to interrupt the conversation really quick to explain what PREA is. PREA stands for Prison Rape Elimination Act. And this act was passed unanimously by both parties in Congress in 2003 with a stated goal of protecting individuals from prison rape. It has evolved into a series of standards created by the Department of Justice. It's a little bit too complicated to explain here what this has to do with trans women and women's prisons, but we will add a link to the PREA Resource Center into the show notes for anyone who wants to read more. Now back to the conversation. Oh, that's interesting. That's not mentioned actually in his little video. He mentions a bunch of other things, but that doesn't come up, the prison laws.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that was something like early 23, and so I'm hoping once he staffs up, there'll be people around him who care about that issue. It just totally depends who he hires.
Wow.
What is the current law around prisons? Is it state by state, or is there a federal law?
Oh God, yeah, that's complicated. There's a federal law that's called PREA, and then that winds up kind of applying to states because any place that accepts federal dollars has to follow PREA as well. So that then it winds up attaching to the state prisons. And then on top of that, states have their own laws that apply to state prisons. So California's most famously is just pure self-ID. So this the guy who's a prisoner says he says he's a woman, so he's supposed to be placed in the women's prison, and obviously that has caused a lot of problems.
Huge.
And yeah. So, and so that's why you'd want like kind of affirmatively good regulations coming out under the Trump administration to tell California, hey, you're going to lose your federal dollars if you do this.
Yeah. Okay. He also says that he wants to stop using federal taxpayer dollars for the promotion or kind of paying for procedures for gender change. And I believe that was both for minors and adults. Not that those will be banned, but that federal tax dollars shouldn't be used for them. Do you know much how would that be implemented, or what does that look like?
I think he said that it would be kind of depriving Medicaid and Medicare funds from those institutions. That's maybe what he said. So that would be like a little bit oblique, because most of these places receive a ton of money through those sources. I think most healthcare providers, so they would not want to lose that option. And if Trump tried that, he would definitely be challenged in court by some very powerful forces.
Okay. What about the right of action for victims to sue doctors? So does that mean there's no statute of limitations, or like what is a right of action as opposed to like the normal avenues by which someone could sue their doctor?
Oh, that is, yeah. Like a right of action is just a name for like how you file a lawsuit. Like your grounds for filing a lawsuit are the right of action. I think, was he referring to things like statute of limitations and make it easier in that way?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
He didn't say the word statute of limitations, or he didn't use that term.
Right. Because these lawsuits are typically brought under state law. So it's not coming to mind how the federal government would be involved directly.
Okay. And then he also said that the Department of Justice is going to investigate big pharma and hospital networks for covering up long-term side effects, which is very interesting because just recently Joanna Olsen-Kennedy, who received, I think, close to $10 million to study puberty blockers in kids, explicitly told the New York Times that she did some research and the data didn't really support their use, and she didn't want to publish the data because she was concerned about how that would be used in court cases. So it was really interesting to hear in hindsight, obviously Trump made that statement many months before this happened with Olsen-Kennedy's research. But what do you think about this idea of investigating big pharma and the hospital networks?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think they could do that. And the Olsen-Kennedy story is interesting because, the House of Representatives is now investigating her for that. And so that brings in another subject, which is both the House and Senate will be controlled by Republicans in January. Right now it's just the House. And so that is another font of investigative power. And so I'm hoping that they as well could. And by the way, a lot of the topics we're talking about could be addressed by Congress as well. So, maybe they could help with things like the medical malpractice suits, making those easier to file. And they could define sex for a whole bunch of laws all at once.
Okay.
To clarify everything.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest piece. I didn't know that Joanna Olsen-Kennedy was being investigated by the House of Representatives. What does that mean?
I think they sent some kind of letter, I think, to her. So asking her to account for herself. What were you doing with this money, and why weren't you publishing? Mm-hmm. I have to admit, I'm not totally familiar with that, but I know that they are looking into it, and that is great. And I hope that we see more of that.
Yeah. One more quick point of clarification. The legal action that Glenna was referring to here is a letter sent from the House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Accountability to the NIH, or National Institute of Health. The NIH supplied the $9.7 million grant to Joanna Olsen-Kennedy's research. And since she's withholding the findings of that research, the House Oversight Committee is requiring that the NIH provide various documentation so the House can figure out what happened to those millions of dollars and why the research hasn't been published. We'll post a link to the letter in the show notes so that you can read it for yourself. Now back to the conversation. Well, I just wanted to say, like, the last thing that Trump really talked about in that video clip was school officials and teachers. So he says something like, if any school official or teacher implies that or tells a kid that they're trapped in the wrong body, they'll face possible civil rights violations for sex discrimination. So that was very interesting to me. Of course, we know lots of parents are listening to this and they've had this very experience with kids at school.
Yeah, well, the Department of Education does have broad powers to enforce, this would be Title IX, for sex discrimination. I think I would want to look at the specific scenario in terms of judging whether it is sex discrimination. But I mean, I am in favor of strengthening that rule for this purpose. I'm also a little bit nervous about it because it's, a little bit of a stretch to say that it's sexist to, like that's almost the logic of the other side of just saying anything having to do with trans issues is sexism. Like, I don't know. On the other hand, I do think it's sexist if you see a gender nonconforming girl. See, I used your word, Stella, and you say, oh, you need to transition.
It's very hard to exist without them.
Yeah. So if you have a gender or sex nonconforming girl and you suggest to her that she might be a boy, then I would say that seems sexist to me under legal precedent going back to 1989. So nothing too novel. So on that score, I would like to run an investigation like that. I think that would be and then you can make an argument that maybe all instances of teachers pressuring kids to transition or what have you are forms of sex discrimination, because we all know that what's going on is kind of the suppression of sex nonconformity. So I'm definitely open to the idea. I think it's really exciting that he raised it. I get a little nervous sometimes when he talks about curriculum because I think at a certain point we need soft power. Like we can't have like the federal government forcing all these random like super liberal schools in New England to teach things they don't want to teach. I'm afraid there'll be some kind of revolt and resistance and it'll become a whole thing and liberals will dig their heels in more. So I think I'm not against it, but I'm just like...
I think there will be a revolt. I think it's so polarized. It looks very like there'll be I don't know what that will look like, but there will be a significant backlash and there'll be a struggle. I'd say it's quite likely.
Yeah, I think so too, or I'm worried about that.
Well, it was something that you came up with earlier. You were talking about the big pharma aspect of it, and I saw that you kind of... I've studied a lot of the history of this and the rise of this movement, and it's extraordinary. And I think you've kind of come to the same kind of, and I want to test whether I'm right or not, the same idea as me, that, and actually if you study most social movements, it's true that people make money of it, but there isn't really a man behind the curtain, you know what I mean, a Svengali actually operating the whole thing. I'm open for there to be one because it's so incredibly ingenious. However, more and more I think, Big Pharma are making money, very like Big Pharma made money out of tobacco, but that didn't mean they created tobacco to make money, if you follow me. Tobacco landed into their hands and they just shut up and let, you know what I mean, they let tobacco make their money. They didn't create it, if you follow me. Is that
I think that basically... Yeah, I mean, if you read how I write, I generally focus on granular things and I'm skeptical of big sweeping explanations. I mean, there's definitely a big outside force that kicks in the early 90s, and it does seem sinister to me, honestly, which is these guys I referred to earlier, like Martine Rothblatt and Phyllis Fry, just like coming up with these ideas and then suddenly making them the reality like so quickly. I do think there's some scary element we don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's really, really interesting because, like you said, and I completely agree, that there was a kind of a golden age, for want of a better phrase, of trans in the kind of 50s, 60s and 70s. They were flying high. It was everywhere. It was really like, it wasn't everywhere. It wasn't in great numbers, but it was definitely becoming accepted. It was, people were transitioning. There was a kind of a place for it in the hospitals. And then in the 70s, they did the test, they did the follow-up. They realised these people are actually deeply disturbed people and they are not happy. So in effect, we got the research way back in the 70s that this, as an intervention, medical intervention, it wasn't working psychologically. It wasn't producing better outcomes. Now, obviously, it was a much different interventions they were having then. The medical sciences advanced. But then there was a death to it in a way. I think the HHS banned it the insurance in 1980. Certainly the 1980s were a low point. And it seems to me that there was a major level of regrouping and strategizing. And they came out so strong in the 1990s. It's like, I think of Helen Joyce saying in her book, that was it in her book, but she certainly said it since, that a very well-known soap opera in Ireland and England is Coronation Street, and the trans activists spent 3 years hanging out in the pub where the scriptwriters wrote the soap opera so that they could convince them to get a trans person into Coronation Street, and they did. And it was the most famous, her name is Hayley, a trans woman, and it was the most famous trans person in the early 2000s. And they did that out of that extraordinary strategic long game thinking. And I think you think that too, that like in the 90s, they came back with extraordinarily well-formed and well-infiltrated scenarios. Is that where you're coming from, that like in the 90s, it took off in a way that we're decades behind it?
Yeah. It's just the scariness of how quickly everything grew in the 1990s. And you can see that these were really forceful personalities. Like Ricky Wilchins was just this total force of nature who, and he had some money, I guess, in an upper middle class kind of way, and a very brutal style of activism where he was the one who kind of shamed gay people into accepting transgenderism as part of their community. So I see these personalities and I'm thinking, like, is the strength of their personality really enough? Is that what did it? Just like these guys having very strong, I mean, maybe it is. We know there's kind of comorbidities with transgenderism, whatever you want to call it. And, maybe one of those personalities is one that is very forceful and that could explain it. But oh my gosh, it was just so fast and maybe it was just luck because, this is profitable. And not that I don't think pharmaceutical companies came up with it, and certainly not in that time period. But it's profitable. And so it was just kind of these two forces connecting and exploding.
Could I take up on that obsessive personality? Because I actually think that is, for whatever about whether they're lesbian or gay or whether they're autistic, it's the obsessive personalities that seem to have kind of got everywhere. There's an amazing documentary from 1979, A Change of Sex, which follows a guy and it follows him every 7 years. And he's completely obsessive. He obsessively goes through everything. He takes court cases. He knocks everybody down. He's an obsessive personality who just obliterates, all the policies because he does not let up.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And that kind of tracks what we see in the history of, some of the most important historical figures.
Maybe in our extended conversation, Glenna, we can touch on that because you've written a lot about the history of gender medicine and some of the activism that has fueled it. And you do a lot of clarification about are we seeing a totally new cohort today, or have kind of gay and lesbian people been, let's say, vulnerable to transing for many, many years. So maybe we can touch on that in the full conversation. But before we let you go, is there anywhere else that you want people to check you out? Of course, we'll include the link to that survey we talked about. Anywhere people can find you, your Substack, of course.
Yeah, just follow my Substack and my X account.
Okay, that's great. We'll include those in the notes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.